the north side of the forum here, in the foreground, you can see the ruins of the Basilica Aemilia with the Senate House or Curia in the background. The Basilica Aemilia was a typical Roman basilica, and that word should just be taken to mean hall. Basilicas were essentially just big closed spaces suitable for things like trials, for which the Romans required large juries, and for other business that needed a large meeting place. You can see that this building had a large central space with a colonnade on either side, just surviving in stumps now, and then a smaller aisle between each column and the wall. You can sort of see where the original wall was on the left. You can't really see that on the right. If you can keep this picture in your mind's eye for a couple of weeks, you'll see just how much this sort of thing influenced the builders of early Christian churches like Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Paul outside the walls, and Santa Sabina. The Senate you see at the rear of the Basilica Aemilia doesn't go all the way back to Trajan's day, but it does go back to the 3rd century AD, and that makes it a very venerable building, certainly. Like many other Roman buildings, it survives to the extent it does because it was turned into a church in the Middle Ages. This is the front of it now. In Republican times, the membership of the Senate was primarily made up of ex-holders of high offices like those of consul and censor. And though it did not have the power to officially pass or revoke laws, its influence was such that little was done in Rome of which it did not approve. It was also from its membership that officials like judges and diplomats were chosen. By the 2nd century AD, its members were in effect appointed by the emperor, but that doesn't mean that even then it was altogether a rubber stamp. It's pretty hard to pick a group of 300 people or so who will always agree with you. This picture of the interior makes it look a little like a warehouse now. But in the 3rd century AD, the walls would have been covered with marble veneer and it would have been a splendid-looking place. This is the original floor, preserved when the Christians put another one down on top of it, which was itself then removed in the 19th century. Stored inside at the right is a kind of balustrade made in Trajan's day, which depicts a religious sacrifice. It used to be part of the decoration of the courtyard in front of this building. In a manner of speaking, the doors of the old Senate still survive. They are now the doors of St. John Lateran across town. It is usually said that there are 3 ancient sets of doors still surviving in the city. These, those on the Pantheon, which were, however, extensively restored in the 16th century, and the doors on the so-called Temple of Romulus in the Forum. The Romulus commemorated here is not the Romulus who founded the city, but rather the son of the 4th century Emperor Maxentius, about whom we'll hear more in a couple of weeks. Some say this temple was in fact not that of Romulus, but in any case, its doors are really in a class by themselves, since they have always been on their original hinges, and the lock still works. Like the Senate building, this became part of a church in the Middle Ages, which helps account for its survival. We've been visiting the Forum Romanum, the Forum, which lies off the lower left as you look at this picture across the Via dei Fori Imperiali. As we saw last quarter, Julius Caesar built the first of the imperial or satellite forums to the north of the Forum Romanum, and Augustus, Vespasian, and Nerva had similar complexes built. The largest of all the imperial forums, though, is that of Trajan, the ruins of which you can see in this picture. By imperial time, the forum was something like a center of white-collar activity connected with government law and business. Trajan's forum was more of a kind of cultural center with two large libraries where the churches there of Santa Maria de Loreto and Santo Nome de Maria are now, behind the column, and behind them was the Temple of Trajan. And on this side of the column was the Basilica Ulpia, named after Trajan's clan. To the right, a large part of the commercial center, which Trajan also constructed, still remains, and we'll hear more about it in a few minutes. Trajan's ashes were buried under the column in the center, which now has a statue of St. Peter on it. This is one section of the column's sculptural decoration. It depicts Trajan with, apparently, at the right, the most celebrated engineer and architect of his day, Apollodorus of Damascus. They are shown here with the amazing 4,000-foot-long bridge he built over the Danube between what are now Romania and Serbia. Apollodorus is also usually now given credit for overseeing the whole Trajan's Forum project. Here's another view of Trajan's column with St. Peter's statue on top. This is more appropriate than it might seem because about 600, Pope St. Gregory the Great became so impressed with Trajan that he interceded on his behalf with St. Peter himself to get him into paradise. Peter is supposed to have agreed just this once to look the other way and let a pagan sneak in. And when Dante visited paradise in 1300, he saw him, so it must have worked. The thing about Trajan, which is supposed to have especially impressed Gregory, was the fact that on one occasion he stopped the whole Roman army to do a favor for a poor woman. But Gregory also thought he'd been tolerant of the early Christians, though modern scholars aren't so sure about this. The column of Trajan itself is essentially the first of its kind. It was essentially just a sort of gigantic tombstone decorated with reliefs of Trajan's accomplishments, campaigns, and so on. In 111, Trajan appointed Pliny the Younger to be the governor of Bithynia, and in their correspondence we have some of the very earliest surviving references to Christians written by non-Christians. It is likely that the very earliest such reference is in the history of Tacitus, which is probably a few years earlier. There are references to the Christians in the work of the Romanized Jewish historian Josephus that are the oldest of all, if they're authentic. They would have been written around 80 A.D., but these references are regarded as later interpolations by many scholars, in part because they're thought too flattering to the Christians at a time when most Romans, including Tacitus and Pliny, regarded them with nothing but contempt. This is one of the ancient gates through the old Roman walls into the city of Nicaea, where Pliny had his headquarters as governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, modern Turkey. This, in fact, is modern Iznik, across the Sea of Marmara from Istanbul. Pliny was a poor administrator, constantly writing back to Trajan and complaining about things like plugged-up sewers, but this liability as an administrator has made him a very important source of information about all sorts of things, including Christianity, because the Christians caused all kinds of trouble for him. Here you can see the theater, which was constructed during Pliny's term of office in Nicaea. It's one of the few things here he might still recognize. I'm going to quote a little of one of Pliny's letters here, and this is a letter written around 111, 112 AD, something like that. As I said, this may not be the very earliest reference to the new sect, but it is, that is, written by someone who wasn't a member of it. But it is one of the earliest and very interesting. Pliny says, "For the moment, this is the line I have taken with all persons brought before me on the charge of being Christians. I have asked them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for punishment for whatever the nature of their admission. I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. They declare that the sum total of their guilt or error amounts to no more than this. They meet regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately among themselves in honor of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purpose, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery, to commit no breach of trust, and not to deny a deposit when called upon to restore it. I have therefore postponed any further examination and hastened to consult you. The question seems to me to be worthy of your consideration, especially in view of the number of persons endangered. Remember, he's writing this letter to Trajan. For a great many individuals of every age and class, both men and women, are being brought to trial, and this is likely to continue. It's not only the towns, but villages and rural districts too, which are infected through contact with this wretched cult. I think, though, that it is still possible for us to check it. Here's another view of the ancient wall around Nicaea. Trajan wrote back saying that Pliny was taking the right approach and that anyone who denied he was a Christian and proved it by making offerings to Roman gods should just be let go. Those who refused should be punished, but the punishment isn't specified. Obviously, Gregory the Great didn't think they were being executed, or he would never have wanted Trajan in paradise, but modern historians, as I said, aren't so sure about this. You may wonder why the Romans disliked the Christians so much. Essentially, it was for the same reason they disliked the Jews. They were regarded as unpatriotic, since they would not pay the proper respect to Romanness, i.e. to Roman gods. But beyond that, it's hard to get a good picture. Tacitus calls them haters of mankind, but exactly what made him think that isn't clear. Some of them may, of course, have been going around talking about the end of the world coming, and in his letters, St. Ignatius of Antioch, traditionally said to be the first Christian thrown to the lions in the Colosseum around 100 AD, talks a lot about the worthlessness of the world, which might have given offense, I suppose, if his fellow Christians had talked this up loudly enough. But that conception, the worthlessness of the world, was hardly foreign to classical philosophy. Some Romans, of course, may have believed that Christians set Rome on fire in 64, which Nero, of course, claimed, but that the Christians were not responsible for this was certainly clear to people like Tacitus, even though he didn't like them. Anyway, for a long time, it was dangerous to be a Christian in Rome, that's clear. As I mentioned earlier, to the north of his forum, Trajan also constructed a vast commercial complex, which survives to a considerable extent today because it was taken over by the church, and in this case turned into a nunnery in the Middle Ages. Gibbon, as I said, thought the 2nd century AD the happiest in human history, but some who actually lived in that century wouldn't agree. The satirist Juvenal, for example, is full of complaints. Here you can see one of the streets so well preserved in this shopping center. I called this a commercial center, but it really has much the look of what would be called a mall today. You could easily imagine businesses like Avis Rent-A-Chariot or the Togo Warehouse in here. Juvenal, as I said, doesn't like this era and says if you go out to dinner at night in Rome, you'd better make your will first. And Rome has arrived at the zenith of vice. It can never be surpassed. He was a teacher, and like all teachers, like all employees, I suppose, thought he wasn't paid what he was worth. Money's sweeter than honey, he says. And when a man loses money, he cries real tears. Juvenal, like Tacitus, Pliny, and Suetonius, belongs to what's called the Silver Age of Roman literature, which follows the Golden Age of Virgil, Horace, Cicero, and Ovid in Augustus's day. This is another view of Trajan's Mall, which still has a part of its original roof surviving. Juvenal's most famous satire is the 6th, which is sometimes called The Way of All Women or The Ballad of Bad Women. I'll quote a little of it here from Edith Hamilton's translation, which is really a paraphrase, in her book The Roman Way. He says, "What man was ever so much in love with a woman as not to hate her 7 hours out of 12? Of course, if you really love your wife, you're lost beyond hope. No woman ever spares the man who loves her. And give up all hope of peace, of course, as long as your mother-in-law lives. There's never a case in court in which a woman is not at the bottom of the business, but what can you expect now that they've taken to wrestling and fencing? Modesty in a woman like that? Actually panting as she goes through her exercises. And suppose you find her with a lover. Is she ashamed? Listen to the lady. We agreed long ago you were to go your way and I mine. Nowadays a woman eats oysters at midnight and drinks till the roof spins. And worst of all are those who want to discuss Virgil and Homer. For heaven's sake, get a wife who doesn't understand all she reads. How I hate a woman who quotes ancient poets to me I never heard of. Juvenal is famous for saying a couple of other things. He says we should all pray for mens sana in corpore sano. That is, for a sound mind and a sound body. But he's also famous for saying that all the Romans really wanted was panem et circenses, which is usually translated bread and circuses, but for the Romans, the circus was a different thing than it is for us, even though they probably would have liked Barnum and Bailey too. For the Romans, though, the circus was above all a place for chariot racing. And you're looking here at another photo of that model, which we've seen before in the Museum of Roman Civilization. At its largest in Trajan's day, the Circus Maximus would hold close to 200,000 people, and since the population of Rome was only about 1,200,000, it held a good part of the city. It was about a third of a mile long, and the chariots went around 7 times. This is the way it looks today, a pretty valuable vacant lot. All you have to do to understand why these races were so popular is watch Ben-Hur again, I think. The chariot racing scene in that movie is still one of the most exciting things on film. This was the superus bolus of antiquity. To the left you can see the ruins on the Palatine Hill, which separates the Circus Maximus from the Forum. The Palatine Hill, and our word for palace, comes from Palatinus, the Latin name of the hill. Like the Capitoline, one of the fabled 7 hills of Rome, the Palatine Hill was sort of the Nob Hill or Piedmont of ancient Rome. Now you see the Palatine Hill from the air as it looks today. From Augustus's day on, it was the usual imperial residence. Augustus himself was born in a house on the hill that used to stand near the northwest corner. His own palace was relatively modest, but his stepson Tiberius set the fashion for building real mansions up here, and the foundations of his place still survive after being much built over. In the late 1st century, Domitian, about whom we heard earlier, built a colossal complex consisting of an official or state palace and a residence, the so-called Domus Augustana, not the house of Augustus, but of the Augustus or emperor, as well as the so-called stadium, which may have been used for some athletic contests, though some think it may have really been just some sort of garden getaway. The whole Palatine Hill is such an architectural palimpsest that it's very difficult to sort it out. It was built over in the Middle Ages, and in the Renaissance, families like the Farnese put up their own palaces on it. H.V. Morton calls it the most ghostly place in Rome. And Byron says he came here to meditate amongst decay, and here to track buried greatness o'er a land which once was greatest, wherein were cast the heroic and the free, the beautiful and the brave, the lords of earth and sea. We're going to see a little bit more of the Palatine Hill in a minute, and while we do so, we'll hear a piece of music. There really is no Roman music to speak of that survives. We've been hearing off and on various excerpts from a CD put together by a group called Synalia, which uses musical instruments like those from the Roman era to try to give some idea, at least, of the sound of the music at the time. But this is a controversial business. As we saw last quarter, the Greeks developed a kind of alphabetic music notation from which some idea of what some pieces of music were like can be gotten. But the Romans did not use, let alone improve, this system to any extent. The piece we're going to hear now is from a different CD, another CD called Musique de la Grèce Antique, produced by a similar group, though, the Atrium Musicae de Madrid, some excerpts of which we also heard last quarter. The music of the Oslo Papyrus, as it's called, which we're going to hear now, is a version of what is at least alleged to be a Roman melody. We'll hear it for what it's worth. When Trajan died in 117, he left the throne to his adopted son Hadrian. Some idea of the spread of Roman civilization by this time can be gotten from the fact that 3 emperors in a row now were born outside Italy. Trajan and Hadrian in Spain, and Antoninus Pius, whom we'll get to next week, in Gaul. Hadrian was certainly one of the most interesting Roman rulers, and was used as the subject of a modern bestseller, The Memoirs of Hadrian, a fictional autobiography by Marguerite Yourcenar, the only woman ever admitted to the French Academy. As we'll see next week, he was a great traveler, and if he was really the architect of the Pantheon in Rome, he was one of the great architects of the ancient world. This is usually said to be the oldest building of any size or consequence in the entire world, which still has its original roof and which has been in constant use. It also has the largest masonry dome ever constructed, 142 feet wide, a foot or so wider than the Dome of St. Peter's. The New Orleans Superdome is 650 feet across, but it's made out of things like saran wrap and plastic and doesn't have the quite the same majestic character about it, and I don't think it'll last 2,000 years. You can see an inscription on the facade that, in abbreviated form, says Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, consul for the 3rd time, made this. This is more than a little puzzling, but the usual view is that Agrippa, the celebrated son-in-law of Augustus, was responsible for an earlier building on the site, and so great was Hadrian's respect for him that he put the dedication to Agrippa back up on the temple that he, Hadrian, had constructed a century later. This isn't completely convincing, but it's the best explanation we have for this anomaly. Here's the interior now, of which no photo can really give you a sufficient impression. The exact method used to construct the dome isn't certain, but it is essentially of brick and concrete, originally dedicated to all the gods. It's the Pantheon. It was given to the church in the 7th century AD and rededicated to all the saints. Later it came to be known as Santa Maria Rotunda, and it is now a museum, though on some occasion services do go on in it. Over the altar you can see what is sometimes called a Hadrianic arch. The Romans, of course, are famous for their use of the arch, but until relatively late in their building history, they used it almost solely for engineering purposes in things like aqueducts and amphitheaters. In the buildings of Hadrian's day, though, we find the arch used as decoration rather than for engineering purposes, to highlight a work of art, the entrance to a building, or as in this case, an altar. The earliest surviving arched colonnade, however, wasn't built until around 300 AD, as we'll eventually see in Diocletian's palace at Split. Thank you. Except for what comes in through the door, the only light that enters the Pantheon comes through the 25-foot wide oculus in the ceiling. And this really does create a memorable effect and can make the interior look very different depending on things like the weather and the time of day. Surprisingly, it takes a pretty heavy rain, in fact, to cause trouble because of an updraft that flows out of the building through the hole. There are drain holes in the floor, however, in case of real cloudbursts. We'll see Raphael's tomb here next quarter and the kings of Italy, since the Risorgimento are also buried here. Okay, that's where we'll wind up this lecture. Next week we'll follow Hadrian off on his travels to places like Britain, Spain, North Africa, and Asia Minor. And we'll go from the century of the good emperors, the 2nd century then, into the century of the bad emperors, the 3rd.